Okay, just check one other thing here. Where is my OBS? There it is. What audio do we have going? Okay, that one, perfect. All right. Okay, let's go. All right, so we're going to finish off talking about youth and religion today. We're talking a little bit about Gen Z and religion, and we're going to get into sort of the central concept of, kind of the research on Gen Z. I think sort of explains what Gen Z religion looks like, and it's very, very different and very, very interesting. From there, and I may make a decision on the fly, we're either going to move to kind of talking about mental health amongst youth or crime. I'm almost done working on the slides for is there a boy/men crisis. They're just not quite there. So I didn't want to start them and have to upload like 5 different files. So I'll push those for after. I didn't really want to do the crime. I wanted to cut it because, it's actually the unit that's been on the chopping block for a few years because I'm bored of it. And it's just not as interesting. So I may just jump to mental health and then come back to the boy crisis after. And skip crime because it's just not, for me, not the most interesting unit and feels very general, which I've probably talked myself out of it now. Okay. So we're talking here. This is where we ended off last class, right? We were talking about Gen Z and religion, and specifically, and maybe I'll just highlight this part, how disconnected Gen Z is from religion institutionally. Now, this isn't unique for Gen Z. And I was having a sort of online conversation with Ryan Burge. And one of the things that he said is, because people have been talking about like a religious revival, right? There's all sorts of stories online about how Gen Z is going back to church in huge numbers and all of this kind of stuff. And he, basically pulled out a bunch and he doesn't believe it. I don't really believe it either so far because I haven't seen any data to back it up. But he pulled out a bunch of data from the General Social Survey that showed, amongst other things, that Gen Z is the least likely to attend religious services either weekly or monthly, right? And certainly weekly plus. They're the least likely as well. Now, I would say, and Ryan's aware of this, this shouldn't be taken in a sense as definitive, because one of the things that's true of Gen Z in general is they're disconnected from doing stuff on the whole, right? They don't work as often. They're not engaged in political activities as much as older generations, right? They don't belong to social clubs, to sports teams, to just about anything, right? They are deeply disconnected institutionally, and their community life is something that has suffered majorly. So one of the things that we know about Gen Z, especially, it's true in the US and it's true in Canada as well, they're very unlikely to be connected with specific religious institutions. And this is just part of their characteristic. They're not connected to much of anything, right? They're much more disconnected than people were in the past, much less likely to belong to any number of institutions, right? From religious institutions all the way to the local bowling league, right? Or the community league, or any of those things. They just don't get involved with much. Okay. I guess we ended off on this slide, right? All these reasons, and I won't reiterate them because we looked at them last time, why Gen Z says they don't turn to religious communities, when in uncertain and difficult times. And this was, I think, particularly notable when this piece of information came out, right? Faced a lot of uncertainty during COVID. Did you turn to your religious communities? And if not, why not? And, they had lots of reasons why they don't turn to their religious communities. So I believe it's the 12th. They must have changed it. I think I initially put it as the 16th because that's what it said on my Bear Tracks when I created the syllabus. Now, sometimes that changes, and I looked at it today, and it says the 12th. So if Bear Track says it's the 12th, but I will double check with the final exam schedule, and I'll post an announcement, but I'm pretty sure it is going to be on the 12th. But again, it's like the other exams for this class. It's open 24 hours. You just have to complete it, right? You'll get the time to do it, undetermined time that I haven't decided yet. But you'll get, whatever time I allot you to do it, and you complete it within that 24-hour window. So same thing, you don't have to come. I might be here, but probably not here in this physical space because I didn't actually book it. Am I responding to emails about the midterm currently? Yes, there's a lot of them. Not just for this class, because I had exams in 3 classes and a paper back. So bear with me, it's gonna take me a sec. I spent an hour and 20 minutes today answering emails and triaging emails because the university enjoys sending me emails that I don't care about, that I have to then consider, is this important? And the union too, it's like they're having their annual general meeting and I'm like, is there anything that I should be aware of? And I had to read the email to find out, and there wasn't. So there, that's how it goes. I am working on it. Probably tomorrow I should be through the bulk of everything. But yeah, it's just taken me a sec. There's a lot. Like I think yesterday I got something like 120 emails between all the things. So it just takes a while to triage them. And then people, I have a SOC 100 class, so they'll send me what's on the midterm, even though I have 3 posts on Canvas telling them what's on the midterm. Or on the final rather. So, just bear with me. My mouse has come to be lost. I am getting there. But I'll make announcements for the final exam date for sure. On Bear Tracks, I know it says the 12th, and I will double check the final exam schedule. That's likely to be correct, but I will make sure. And that's good for me, because it gives me lots of time to mark it before Christmas. Okay. All right, so with regards to their religious communities, one of the things or religious communities around them, one of the things that's pretty clear with Gen Z is that they think that there's a values gap, meaning that they think they care more about things than their, particular issues than their religious communities do. Okay, this is a really kind of a weird way of reporting this information and asking the question. And I'm not in love with it, but it is interesting nonetheless, right? So if you look at the top green bar, I think I have it cut off here, but the top green bar is basically the percentage of young people who responded that they care about this issue. The dark green bar on the bottom is they think their religious communities care about these issues too, and then the orange part is the gap, right? So what we see in terms of things that are important to young people, they perceive there being a big gap between them and religious communities, right? And in most cases, it's not just a double-digit gap, it's a 20% plus gap, right? So they think they care a lot more than their religious communities do. Now, that's not to say the religious communities don't care about these things, but that is their perception of how much their religious communities care about it, right? So on everything other than gun reform, you basically have a 20-plus point gap. And I'm going to count Black Lives Matter here as a 20-point gap because it's 19 and that's close enough, right? At the very top, right, LGBTQA plus rights, that's a 27% gap, the biggest of any of them, and gender equity, right, a 25% gap. So, and not necessarily, bless you, surprising on any of those marks, right? These are things that are kind of contentious and culture war-y and things that definitely religious communities have often sort of, been against in some way, right? And especially, say, like in the US with gender equity, right? You have increasing movements, especially amongst evangelicals, that are, probably more kind of traditionalist, patriarchal, men have their place, women have their place, and never the twain shall meet kind of things going on in some of that culture. And you can look at, I don't know, figures like Doug Wilson. I can't remember what church he runs, but it's in Moscow, Idaho, and apparently he's a big deal. Pushing a lot of kind of, complementarianism, I think is the term that's used. Men and women are supposed to have different but complementary roles. So no, I think real big surprises here. Maybe that one I would say I'm a little bit surprised on. But again, given evangelicals in particular, and they're very pro-capitalist bent, maybe that's not entirely surprising. Okay, so that said, in what I think we could see as being somewhat in continuity with the National Study of Youth and Religion, right? So we saw all that stuff, and I painfully made you go through all these charts, where it kind of shows a different level of, better adaptation to adolescence and emerging adulthood amongst those devoted young people in the National Study of Youth and Religion. We see something kind of similar here in the Springtide data. Now, one thing I will say, the way this is asked is not nearly as robust, right? So the way that Smith and Denton and then Smith and Snell did it in the National Study of Youth and Religion is they asked very specific questions about very specific aspects of young people's lives, and then said, this is what we think, a young person that's doing well, right, looks like. They have these characteristics, and this is what, a young person who we think is doing less well, right? They take more drugs, they drink more, right? All of those sorts of things. Now, this is a much less, and this is, sorry, I teach a methodology class as well. I know if you've taken it with me, it's painful, but it's important too. If I'm critiquing kind of survey research, these are much less robust questions, right? Because you're asking people kind of to self-report how much they think they're flourishing. And you're gonna have, I think, way more social desirability bias creep into something like this. However, it's still an interesting kind of portrait. Oh, the other thing I think is interesting in the way Springtide split up the data, and they put this data online about 2 months ago. I keep meaning to go dig through it and put it into R and play around with it, and I just have not had the time. My ring is loud. Okay. They only split the sample here and what we can see into, the very religious and the not religious at all. So essentially you're devoted and you're disengaged by Smith and Denton's kind of categories. So we don't have those middle categories here, which I think would be really interesting. Okay, with all of that preamble, and again, I don't love the way these questions are asked. If I were to ask them, I would ask them differently, but they didn't ask me how they should ask the questions, so there you go. And sometimes when you're making a survey, you gotta create a survey that you think people are actually gonna answer, and I suspect that's what happened here. Okay, so they asked them, are you flourishing a lot? So, they asked them, are flourishing a lot, flourishing a little, or not flourishing at all in these different categories? And what we see is kind of similar to what we saw in, amongst millennials in that National Study of Youth and Religion data, which is that it looks like those very religious youth are doing a little bit better. And here, because this Springtide data, is, kind of 13 to 25-year-olds, right? We've got a good chunk of our teenagers and emerging adults in this sample. So they seem to think, right, that they're flourishing, I guess about, it's been a long day. I was going to tell you about my other class, but you don't care. It was awesome. We had a lot of fun, but 3 hours of that class makes me very tired. Okay, 37% of the very religious said they were flourishing a lot in romantic relationships. Now again, I think it would be interesting to see how many of them are saying they're somewhat flourishing, right, or flourishing a little, but all we have here is the flourishing a lot. Now that is still a pretty good spread, a 14% spread over the 23% of the not religious at all that say, in their romantic relationships, they're flourishing a lot. In friendships, right, it's almost 50% that say they're flourishing a lot compared to just over a third. Again, 15% gap. Big gap, in family relationships. And again, if I was to scroll back, which I won't do, because you can do that yourself, and look at the charts, for how people relate to their, their parents, amongst that National Study of Youth and Religion data, again, what we saw was a fairly big gap in terms of family relationships for those who were the devoted in that sample, right? Here it's a 20% gap. Relationship with trusted adults, right? That one's super important. Let's not forget that, right? Again, we're talking about that National Study of Youth and Religion data. What was really interesting about the devoted is they had more adults that they related to, right? So relationships with trusted adults, this is a massive gap, right? 41% of the devout or of the very religious, I'm getting my terms mixed up, said they were flourishing a lot in that versus only 16% of the not religious. So again, there's meaningful differences in very religious and non-religious youth, and it's super interesting. And I'll go through these last ones really quick. At work, right, we got a 20% gap. The only one that actually crosses that 50% barrier here is 51% say they're doing well at home, a 22% gap in finances. I don't know how many, I guess we have some emerging adults. I was gonna say how many teenagers are worried about finances. But here, right, still we have a solid 20% gap. Physical health, a 22% gap. In mental health, right, and I think this one's important, a 24% gap. And there's on social media, right, a 15% gap. And here, I don't have a slide on it, but you can look, Donna Freitas has another book, and I can see it in my head, and I can't remember the title of it. It has a bunch of smiley faces on the cover. Anyway, and she talks about this as well in that book where she did some research. And one of the things she says is that religious youth seem to be a little bit better at putting social media into a sort of context where it didn't dominate their sense of self-worth. Okay, so moving on. There's some really interesting data, which I don't have here, on kind of trusted relationships with trusted adults amongst young people. It's quite interesting, but basically, one of the things actually I have it later. It's in the mental health unit. I'm gonna show it to you in a bit. So keep this number in mind, right? I just remembered, I'm like, where is it? It's in the mental health unit. It's a really important number, right? Trusted adults make a big, big difference in the lives of young people. As any young person, I think, who's had a lot of trusted adults can tell you. Okay, how am I doing for time? Super duper good. All right, let's do this. Faith unbundled. All right, so what is this term? If I were to say something, right, for our millennials, the term in terms of their religious identities or their religious beliefs that's really key is moralistic therapeutic deism, or MTD, right? For Gen Z, it is faith unbundled, right? Okay, so this comes out of this same Springtide study. Specifically, this report was written by a guy named Josh Packard, a really, really nice guy too. Had a chance a couple times to chat with him, ask him some questions. He's a really, really nice guy. He's not at Springtide anymore. He's moved on to working for the USCCB, or the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops now. But I really liked Springtide's work, especially when he was the director. He's not, and he was the founder, but he's not there anymore. They still do good work. I just don't think it's quite as good, because I think he's a better social scientist than the people who are there now. But regardless, okay, so he came up with, looking at the data on young people, how they construct their religious identities, right? What their religious identities actually look like. And he calls it faith unbundled. And here, what he says is it's a lot like, think of digital media, right, as compared to older forms of media. And so the article that he wrote about this is actually called, Spotify as a religious metaphor. So what does this mean, right? Now, think about it this way. Your Spotify feed or Apple Music or whatever you use, some of you psychopaths probably even use YouTube Music with its terrible interface. Who knows? I really hate YouTube Music. It's really bad. And I will die on this hill. But all of your feeds look a little bit different, right? They are customized almost entirely to you because, those algorithms have learned about you. You've picked only those songs and artists that you really like. And so, what shows up for you when you go to listen to music is something that's customized just for you. This is somewhat the same if you think of like Netflix, but probably Spotify and other music services are the most customized just to your interests. Okay, maybe YouTube as well, like the actual YouTube, because it knows what you're interested in watching, right? So it is constructed out, although I'll say YouTube's probably not as good a metaphor. Spotify is a little bit better of one because you actually actively play a role in constructing your music identity on Spotify. And what Packard says is that the way young people construct their religious identities now is very similar to that. Okay, so what does it look like? I'm going to highlight this again because it's really important and interesting. So young people, oops, that is a pen. What a failure I am. So disappointed with myself. There we go. Young people construct their faith by combining elements such as belief, identity, practices, and community from a variety of religious and non-religious sources. I'll dig into that in a sec. And I'm going to highlight this again in a different color because it's really, I think, interesting and important. Rather than receiving all these things from a single intact system or tradition. So if we were to draw a contrast, say, between the boomers, Gen Xers, millennials, the boomers, the Xers, and the millennials, and Gen Z, all of these groups are more likely, when they're constructing their religious identity, to have taken things kind of whole cloth from one religious tradition, probably the one they're born into or one that they adopt, right? So like, if you are religious, you are Catholic. And, whether you like it or not, you kind of take the whole Catholic bundle, right? Or the Muslim bundle or the Hindu bundle. What Packard is saying is that Gen Z doesn't do that. They're going to take elements from here, 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 and kind of combine them into their own religious identity, right? So today, they no longer rely on a single institution to make sense of their identity, engage in community, outline the boundaries of belief, or offer practices that mark significant moments, right? They take from whatever works. And again, I'll probably repeat myself on the next slide, and that's okay. One of the things that Packard said, in a presentation that he did, that I attended, that I thought was really interesting, is what he expected was that young people, even those, mysterious, spiritual, but not religious young people, they would adopt these systems kind of wholesale, right? So if you were like non-Christian spiritual, you would, go to the Wicca section at Chapters or on Amazon, and you would get like a book of Wiccan something or other, or some Reiki crystals or a Buddha statue, and that would be your identity. And then if you were on the Catholic side, you would pick up a rosary and you'd start praying the rosary and whatnot. Or maybe, on the New Age side, you do tarot cards. And what he said is that's not actually what he found in talking to young people, because it isn't so much either or, but more of a both and, right? So young people would have been like, yeah, I use tarot cards and I pray the rosary, or I, do yoga and Kabbalah, right? They're mixing and matching different religious traditions from the available cultural material to construct a religious identity that works just for them. Okay, now I've written too many things. I'm going to erase my things because I want to keep talking about this. This kind of makes sense, right? when we think about what Gen Z looks like demographically, right? So if we think of Gen Z, it's very pluralistic, right? Good chance if you're Gen Z, you know someone who's Muslim, you know someone who's Hindu, you know someone who's, evangelical Christian, probably a Roman Catholic, right? You have a pretty broad palette of people around you and religious materials that are sort of around, that you're aware of. You also, have the internet. So if you're looking for interesting spiritual practices, you have the internet to go and just kind of look at what different traditions do. And then you can combine them into a package that's meaningful just for you. Now, again, kind of like your Spotify, your religious package will probably look quite different from everyone else's. And it'll include a bunch of stuff that's like, religious, from this religion, that religion, another religion, some things that aren't religious at all, like, a deep belief in, environmentalism or, some political causes that get really bundled into an identity that's kind of quasi-religious, but it's kind of just yours, right? Because no one else is going to have one that matches exactly your kind of profile. Now, that's really difficult for institutional religion to sort of track because everybody is very different. Everybody has different kind of practices and beliefs, and that means there's not a lot of consistency. Or, I think religious institutions in the past were very much pitched at kind of the middle, right? The kind of religious moderate. And now everybody's kind of all over the place, especially with Gen Z. Okay, so this is the last slide for religion. And like the 9 cultural facts, I have not. Yes, I believe that's what I said. Okay, I haven't seen a question slide in a minute. That's okay. All right, so what does it mean for religion to be unbundled? Basically, you can think of these as kind of 4 major kind of threads that sort of explain what unbundling religious belief looks like. And again, unbundling it from institutions. So, what does it look like to unbundle belief from a single source or system? So what does Packard say here? Let me grab the highlighter. So it looks like young people who turn to many, and like I said, lots of sources for making meaning and discerning what to believe about right, wrong, the purpose and calling, right? The meaning of life, suffering, salvation, and all of that stuff. And the key word that he cites is curiosity, right? And here, I think this is really important, and I'll say this again. In talking to Josh, one of the things that I kind of asked him, he didn't like this question, by the way. He was very polite about it, but he didn't like the question. I asked whether Faith Unbundled was basically just MTD updated, right? Because you could kind of see it, right? It's a pretty loose coalition of beliefs. It's good for a pluralistic society, kind of like MTD is. And one of the things that he said was no. He doesn't like MTD as a term at all, but he didn't think MTD did a good job of explaining Gen Z religion. And here's what he said. The reason that he thought, and it comes down to this point of curiosity, so I promise it's all connected. The reason he thought this wasn't a good explanation is because from his experience talking to Gen Z about their religious identities, he thinks they work really hard, right? That they're working really hard to figure out what their religious identity is, right? They're asking questions, they're seeking things, they're curious about different traditions, they're exploring, they're asking questions. And so Gen Z spirituality, whether it's institutional or not, is very active, right? And what he doesn't like about the idea of MTD and maybe more millennial spirituality is that he views MTD as sort of suggesting that when it comes to religious identity, young people are very passive, right? That they're just sitting there with kind of a great indifference to religious questions, and taking this very, that 5-point creed of moralistic therapeutic deism as good enough. And he's like, no, that's really not Gen Z. They're super curious, right? They're doing Kabbalah, they're doing tarot cards, and they're trying out the rosary, and they're doing yoga, right? And retreats in the woods and all sorts of spiritual practices that maybe don't look typical for institutional religion, but nonetheless are very active, right? So they're very curious, and they have a lot of, they're very engaged in trying to figure out these religious questions, right? They're not indifferent. Okay, so identity. What does it look like when separated from a single source or system? And again, I think this is a kind of an interesting point. He says that it's wholeness, right? That young people increasingly, whereas in the past, right, if you had a religious identity, right, and you were boomer, silent, a boomer, Gen X, millennial, and you had some kind of disagreement or maybe a part of a religious identity that didn't quite track, you just kind of squished that down, right? Your views of LGBTQ people are different than, say, the religious institution you belong to or whatever, right? There's always things that you might not agree with. You just kind of squish that down. You belong, maybe you adopt that belief, or you kind of hang there in a discomfort. What Packard says is that basically young people increasingly are unwilling to do that, right? They're not willing to kind of compartmentalize or cut off a part of themselves to fit into a prescribed narrative about who they should be or how they should look in the world. So if they're going to attend religious institutions, they want those institutions to welcome them as they are, right? They're not willing to leave a part of themselves at the door. And he says it looks like a commitment to wholeness, right? Your whole identity and bringing your whole self into whatever you do. And if you can't, you don't do it. Okay, last two. What does it look like to unbundle community from a single source? And this one's pretty straightforward, right? Young people show up where trusted personal relationships exist or new ones seem possible, right? And if they don't seem possible, right, if people aren't willing to take them as they are, they'll forego those places, right, and look somewhere else, right? So they don't just show up to communities, because they've been there forever, right? They're looking for places where, they can build meaningful relationships. And this makes sense, especially given that Gen Z is really kind of lacking in really deep relationships, especially with trusted adults. Okay, and practice, okay, I kind of already talked about this, right? They're very flexible in terms of their practice. They adapt lots of different rituals from different sources into something that works for them, right? So religion and faith become something that they no longer fit themselves into. They make it fit them. So that's what it looks like. Okay. Yes. Yeah, I think, the case that I think I would make is that MTD is probably more typical of the way millennials thought about religion, and faith unbundled is much more of a Gen Z kind of thing. And it speaks to, I think, the different environments. Again, if we want to go back to Jean Twenge and her technology model of generations, right? Millennials grew up in a time, there's a lot, kind of at the beginnings of the internet, but the possibilities of identity were not as vast as they are today, right? Whereas Gen Z has been immersed in the internet and social media and pluralism for their entire lives. The communities millennials grew up in got more pluralistic as they got older. For Gen Z, I think it's been pluralistic from the very beginning. So yeah. No, MTD is very much the millennials, right? Because if we look, hang on. I won't go back. I was going to go back slides, but we look at the National Study of Youth and Religion, right? The study starts in 2001, and it starts with 13-year-olds, right? Which means they're born, in the late 80s? We don't get Gen Z until the earliest that we put Gen Z is around 1995, 1996, right? But the bulk of Gen Z, right, hasn't even been born by the time we hit here, because right, we're talking 1990, 95, 96 to 2010 is about Gen Z, right? So, we can't be talking about Gen Z because a lot of them were in diapers. And the other ones wouldn't have been in that 13 to 18 category of the National Study of Youth and Religion. So National Study of Youth and Religion, MTD, is very much a millennial thing. Okay, cool, 13 minutes, what to do. I hear whispers of let us go. We just have no time left. We careen painfully towards the end and we're running out of time. Why don't we start with a little bit of mental health? We'll maybe touch on crime if I have time later in the course, but I really want to talk about the boys and men stuff because I think it's really interesting. And so let's talk about some mental health stuff here. And if you've been feeling good about anything you've learned in this course so far, prepare to feel much worse about everything. Okay, so, and I am sorry. So, since we just finished with Springtide, it feels okay to just come back to them right away. Right, so Springtide Research Institute, one of the questions they asked in their 2022 research on young people is how are they doing, right? Especially in terms of loneliness. And the conclusion, the title of the report from that year is, Gen Z, America's Loneliest Generation. So, not great. Loneliness, increasingly, I think this is something that more and more kind of social researchers are really, really concerned about because it is a growing problem as our societies have become more atomistic, more disconnected, as we go out and do things less, right? As, Netflix and chill has become Netflix and just Netflix. Just sit there by yourself and watch Netflix, maybe chat online on Discord. Loneliness has become a bigger sort of question. Okay, we can look at a couple of prominent studies, right? Cigna did a study of 20,000 US adults 18 years and older. And what did they find? Well, everybody's pretty lonely, but the chief finding was that Gen Z is the loneliest generation and claims to have worse health than other generations. Now, we'll talk about social media when we talk about Jonathan Haidt's book, probably next week, The Anxious Generation. Social media use alone doesn't seem to be a predictor of loneliness, right? Heavy social media users and those who use very little have similar scores. Now, what probably accounts for this is that, it's just kind of a group effect. Social media is now so pervasive that even if you don't use social media, you're likely to see the kind of results that social media causes in society because everyone else is using it, right? If you're like that one or two people in Gen Z that doesn't use some kind of social media, right? Like my 12-year-old son complains bitterly about this. We have a very strict rule that we won't let our kids use social media until they're at least 16. We're the meanest people in the world, but all of his friends have social media because everyone else's parents are terrible. I'm like, Dad, sometimes it sucks to have a sociologist as a dad. I'm like, I know, son. I know. Can I have social media? No, absolutely not. Terrible for you. Talk to me when you turn 16, right? But because everyone else is using it, right, any mental health effects, any kind of loneliness effects are actually going to be the same for him as if he was using it because all of his friends use it, right? So you can't escape generational trends. Okay. Other research, Ford, right, the car company, because they do a lot of marketing research, right, and they want to figure out what trends are. By the way, the person who wrote the report for Ford Motor Company, I think has the coolest title of anyone. It is Ford's chief futurologist. And I don't know why, but I want the title of chief futurologist desperately. I just want to be the chief. I might just create an organization just so I can be chief futurologist, because it sounds so cool. Like, can you imagine handing someone a business card and being like, hello, I'm the chief futurologist. You're welcome. Right? Awesome name. So he wrote the report. What did they find in a 2020 national survey used for marketing? Well, they found loneliness as one of the most pressing issues confronting society, right? And what do we find? Trust in institutions and brands was declining, and that many people lack trusting relationships with peers as well, and that this was undermining the whole social fabric of the United States, right? So not great. Again, chief futurologist, cool title. All right, so Springtide did their own research, right, in 2019. 1,000, so this must be their 2021 study. 1,000, so this is pre-COVID, right? This is really important because pre-COVID, so we haven't hit COVID yet. So that's good because we can get a sense of how bad things were before COVID, so no one can be like, oh, it's just COVID. Okay, they surveyed 1,000 young people and did 35 qualitative interviews. They used my favorite index and yours, and if you've taken social research methods with me, you've heard me go on and on about the UCLA Loneliness Index and how awesome it is. It's 20 questions. It measures loneliness. They asked this for these 1,000, 13 to 25-year-olds, and what they found, lots of them had high rates of loneliness, social isolation, and stress. This one I think is interesting, which is why I put it there on the slides that I made. They struggled in the that should be the qualitative. I need to fix that. I'll fix that after class. The qualitative portion of the study. So when they were being interviewed, to know where they felt like they belonged, right? Where they felt belonging. And this happens sometimes, right? We ran into this at the beginning of the course, right? Trying to make millennials understand a question about objective morality. Millennials had a really hard time understanding it. Belonging in terms of where for Gen Z was really, really hard, because belonging wasn't a quality of place, it's a quality of people, right? You don't belong to an institution, you belong to people, right? People make you feel like you belong. So it's a different kind of focus for Gen Z. They feel belonging with people, not necessarily institutional settings. So again, you see that deinstitutionalization really biting with Gen Z. Okay. So, I'm just breathing deeply. My wife tells me sighing is very stress relieving. Okay, so 1 in 3 young people reported feeling completely alone much of the time, right? And here I will say being part of a religious community did not provide any significant protection against loneliness. Now, again, this is going to be except for, the devoted / very religious, right? The quality of someone's religion matters a lot more, and that's what we saw in that National Study of Youth and Religion data, right? There's a lot of people who are kind of loosely attached to religious organizations. It's only for the ones that are really committed to it that you see protective effects, right? Okay, so what did we see? What did we see in the sad data? Don't worry, it gets so much worse than this. Like, this is just like the cherry on top. The cherry on top is the good part. It's like the fudge stuff at the bottom, I guess. My metaphor is broken down completely. I'm going to stop. Jasmine is never going to speak to me again. I guess it is. What's the worst part of like a sundae? It's just all good? This is just the melted ice cream part. Okay, the metaphor is clearly falling apart, so let's not continue. Okay, so I have nobody to talk to, right? And this is sometimes or always, right? So almost 40% of the young people surveyed here said they had no one to talk to sometimes or always. A third of them felt completely alone, sometimes or always. Again, almost half of them, 45%, felt no one understood them sometimes or always. No one really knows them sometimes or always. And 2/5 said it was really hard it's difficult for them to make friends. So tough stats, right? And again, you see some variations here, like slightly lower numbers for those who attend religious services, but it's not particularly statistically meaningful. Okay, so using that the UCLA Loneliness Index, these are all kind of questions about loneliness, right? So all of these questions, ranking it from like always, sometimes, seldom, never, these are questions that are part of the UCLA Loneliness Index. And we see kind of the way that young people scored, right? All right, I have nobody to talk to. So nearly 1 in 10 young people said they always have nobody to talk to. Almost a third said sometimes. 12% said they feel left out always. Another quarter of them said they feel left out sometimes. Their relationship, 7% said their relationships are superficial always. A quarter of them said sometimes. This one I find really interesting because sometimes, you read a book that tells you the future, but today, I read this book back in 2010. It's called Alone Together. This is Sherry Turkle. Really interesting book. And I think what this, so it's 10%, 1 in 10 young people say they always feel like people are around them but not with them. And then almost 30% say sometimes, right? So for nearly 2/5 of the sample. I think what you see there is the effect of phones, right? You're sitting with your friends and everybody is on their phone. People are half paying attention to what's going on. You go out for dinner, when people could afford to go out for dinner before every entree cost $33. But, in that magical time, the before times, and you would go out with a friend and both of you are sitting there on your phones looking stuff up, right? That's kind of what that is. And Turkle reported this relatively early, that once smartphones had kind of entered the space, following the invention in 2007, that people increasingly were reporting that they felt like they were alone even when they were with people. I have 30 seconds. They also feel isolated from others, 10%. So 1 in 10 young people said they felt isolated from others, always, with another quarter saying they felt isolated from people sometimes. All right, we'll pick up these very happy statistics on Friday. Today is Wednesday. Time has no meaning. Reading week destroys my sense of time. Okay.
I do it. I'm gonna turn off my live stream, which I constantly forget to do. Oh.